Welcome back. Today we are going to do a quick one on the Kiwi Ears Altruva headphones. So here they are up close, and this is about what you would expect in the sub $100 range. Got lots of Kiwi Ears logos on it, but this looks like wood. It's actually plastic, kind of a faux wood. You do get two sets of pads. These are the leather. There's a suede pad in the box as well. Kind of looks like that on the inside. So it's kind of definitely a mix of kind of plastic and metal and leather, pretty much what you would expect at this price point. I think they kind of got the build very kind of price appropriate is what I would call it. You do get a really long cable, which is kind of sleeved in fabric, and that's kind of nice as well. But I think for the most part, I wanted to kind of talk about, this one's going to be a little bit different. Talk a little bit about how they marketed this particular set and sort of what the sound signature looks like on the graph. But first, we'll start with it. What is it? It's a 50 millimeter dynamic driver. It does have an open back design. That metal mesh is open. You can definitely hear things through it, and it definitely broadcasts your music out the back. Two sets of pads, about $69, and it happens to be on sale right now at $62 on Linsole. So that's kind of the basics of what it is. The graph itself, I think the first time I looked at the graph, I'm like, it looks kind of fun. It looks a little energetic. It's got some nice boost, That's going to be a very fun sound. And then when you start reading kind of their marketing of it, and it says that Kiwi Ears would say Altruva delivers a studio accurate sound, studio grade clarity and balance, tuned like a reference monitor. And at first I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. It's not my first thought when I looked at this graph. It looks very energetical, boosted, quite fun. Something that's going to get your attention, but mainly a fun signature, and that's fine in a nice open back set like this. Sub $100, I think people want fun. So when I started reading, studio accurate and reference and monitor, I'm like, I'm not sure how that all works together. But what I would say, kind of where they're coming from, is sometimes you get the person who tunes a particular set or the brand who tunes a particular set has certain listening preferences, and whether that is maybe lower volume listening preferences, or they tune to particular genres of music, which may not be the same genres of music that you listen to. That's what kind of struck me here, is that when you start looking at this signature, and you're like, man, that's actually quite boosted, and I'm not sure if that's going to really play well with the music that I listen to. It's not really going to sound reference or studio accurate, but when you start thinking about where this would sound studio accurate and how do you give a very natural lower mid style sound to vocals, it's on tracks that don't have a whole lot of bass. And that's what this tuning is sort of really leaning towards. If you really want to hear Altruva in this studio accurate sound, you do have to stay away from genres that do play right into that bass bump and really listen to tracks that don't have much bass, definitely not bass-led genres. And then, it definitely kind of takes on this studio accurate sound or tune like a reference monitor. But as long as your tracks don't have a whole lot of bass, it does kind of take on a more natural sound in that way. So I think that's sort of what was going on here. And when you look at the graph and you try to figure out what they meant by the marketing, I just think that it was tuned for genres that aren't necessarily bassy or bass led or have a whole lot of bass to them. So this nice bump right here actually does lean into giving the vocals body, and the lower mids have body, and it will come across as kind of full and natural, especially in an open back, and that's kind of where they were going with that. So the sound, again, I would say it's more V-shaped like the graph. It's definitely bass heavy for reference or studio accurate, even with the open back. I think even with the open back, this still comes across as a heavier bass style set. And the bass, again, I would say it's more of a fun sound than studio or reference, because I listen to tracks with a little bit more bass. I was really hoping the open back would vent more, or you would get a little bit of leakage from the pads, as the bass is actually quite heavy. And really, to get the fast and the punchy bass that they talk about in the marketing, it's there on some tracks, but on others, especially on those more bass-led genres, it's just going to be very present. That's quite a boost right there in the bass, and it will kind of linger a little bit too much. It's very sensitive to the tracks and bass levels, and I definitely prefer tracks with less bass because it just sounds closer to the description. Very much what I already talked about. The farther away you go from tracks that have heavy bass presence right there, the more natural this will sound and more like the description that they talk about there. And I do think that EDM was a little bit too much. Rock and drums can definitely hit that fast and punchy bass, and those kind of sound fun. But yeah, for me, it was just kind of, I had hoped that this would have been a little bit flatter, not so much of a fun sound, but more of a flatter, more of a reference style, especially on tracks that had a little bit more bass to it. And the mids, again, to hit that studio grade clarity that they talk about, it does help to have less bass, and then the mids are less V-shaped and recessed. Again, this will kind of play right into the graph, especially if you have tracks that kind of hit this hard and kind of hit this. The mids will fall back a little bit because this is V-shaped, and it will take on some of those characteristics. But again, if you tune this to music like a classical, which is definitely flatter, doesn't have this kind of bass bump to it, it definitely has more of a studio quality, flat reference style. Studio grade clarity is how they would talk about it. And I think it does open up more like an open back should on those style tracks. I do wish the bass was more vented, mainly on vocal tracks. You just get more of that sense of that reference style, a DD, natural sound, and treble contribution. All the things kind of come across more in vocal styles. So Angus and Julia Stones, they're big jet planes, kind of a older song, but if you could hear both sides of this style tuning, because right in the beginning, not a whole lot of bass contribution, and the whole thing sounds big and open, and you get this kind of clarity to it, which is really, really nice. And then when the drums kind of kick in, you're like, oh yeah, that kind of feels just a little bit too heavy. The vocals kind of fall back just a little bit because this is really heavy, and I think that track just tended to show both sides of this style tuning. And the treble, again, another part where you listen to it in isolation, it's actually quite fine, but will vary track to track on how extended or sound over or under the bass it gets, depending on your track. And if you EQ the bass down a little bit under the mids, you can really get the mids and the treble to sound closer to reference, closer to an open back neutral bass shelf, which is kind of what I was hoping for. You know, again, I think this was just tuned in a particular manner to a certain genre of music that probably does sound studio accurate and reference and monitor and all the great things that they marketed it as. But do be aware that if your tracks do have kind of a heavier bass component, this will come across as a heavier bass set and possibly more of a fun set instead of a studio accurate set. So that is what I got on the Altruva. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I will see you next time.